There are 4 words that can break a person faster than shouting ever could. Not loud words, not dramatic words, just quiet ones, calm ones, the kind that slip into the air and change the shape of your life before you even understand what they mean. Check your wife's purse. That was it. 4 words. No warning. No build-up. Just 4 words spoken in the front seat of a black SUV on a Thursday night outside Charlotte. And by the time John Delaney stepped into his own house an hour later, the life he thought he was living had already started to come apart. Now, before I tell you what was in that purse, you need to understand who John Delaney was, because stories like this don't hit the same unless you understand the person standing at the center of them. John was 43 years old, born in New York, raised by a father who worked too hard for too little, and a mother who knew how to stretch every dollar until it almost cried. John grew up watching what it looked like when life pressed down on a man and never let up. 2 jobs, long hours, bills stacked on the kitchen table, a kind of tired that settled into the walls. He made a promise to himself early, the kind of promise boys make when they still think hard work can protect them from every kind of pain. He said he would build a different life. And for the most part, he did. By 35, John had built Delaney Transport into a serious logistics company out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Not a giant empire, not the kind of business that gets magazine covers, but real money, real contracts, real people depending on him. He did somewhere between 8 and 12 million a year, depending on the market, and he built it without becoming the kind of man success usually turns people into. That mattered. John was not loud. He was not flashy. He didn't walk around trying to prove he had made it. He wore simple shirts, good boots, drove a truck because he liked trucks, went to church most Sundays, called his mother every week. The people who worked for him respected him because he did something a lot of successful men forget to do once money comes in. He treated people like they were human before he treated them like they were useful. And if you've known men with power, real power, you know how rare that is. So when I say John loved his wife, I don't mean casually. I don't mean the way people say they love each other while already halfway out the door. I mean he loved her with the full weight of man who does not hand his heart over easily. Joyce Delaney was 39. Before that, she was Joyce Paris from Atlanta. Smart, polished, beautiful in the kind of way that made people turn and look twice, but that wasn't the part that got John. He told a friend once, years later, that what got him first was the way she talked about work, the way she talked about building something. She had a master's in marketing from Georgia State and a small consulting firm when they met at a business conference in Dallas. She wasn't some damsel drifting through life waiting to be rescued. She was sharp, capable, ambitious, and John respected that before he ever fell in love with her. They dated for 2 years. He proposed in Savannah by the waterfront, not in front of a crowd, not with a hidden camera and rose petals and all that nonsense. Just the 2 of them and a ring he had custom-made because he knew exactly what he wanted his life to look like and who he wanted standing next to him in it. They got married. They moved into a big house in Ballantyne. 7 bedrooms, pool in the back, enough space to make success feel real. For the first years, everything looked solid. Not perfect because nothing is but solid. People who knew them said they seemed good together. John traveled more as the business grew. Joyce had her own work, her own schedule, her own world inside the marriage. It made sense. It looked like one of those modern marriages where both people are independent enough to respect each other and close enough to make it work. And maybe for a while, that's exactly what it was. But most people think marriages break in some huge, visible moment. Some explosion, some scandal, some obvious turning point everyone can point to later and say, there, that's where it started. That is almost never how it really happens. Most of the time, it starts quietly. So quietly that if you are the one inside it, you miss it. Or maybe you don't miss it. Maybe you feel it and refuse to name it because naming it would force you to live inside a truth you are not ready for. People around John and Joyce would later say things began to shift somewhere around year 7. Not in a dramatic way. Not enough for anyone to call a crisis. Just small things. Missed moments. A different tone. A strange distance that didn't announce itself loudly enough to be confronted. If you know anything about relationships, you know how dangerous that stage can be. Not because the love is always gone, but because routine makes silence easy. And silence gives people room to drift in directions they never intended to go. That was around the time Ray Torres came into John's life. Ray was 47, ex-Army, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, then private security after he left the military. He eventually ended up with a Charlotte firm that handled executive protection. That's how John hired him, mostly because as the business grew and contracts got bigger, people started advising him to think more seriously about security. John wasn't paranoid. He wasn't the type, but he listened. And Ray had the kind of presence that made people feel safer without him needing to say much. He was one of those men who could sit in a room for 6 hours and somehow still control it by noticing everything that moved through it. Ray did not waste words. He did not fill silence to make other people comfortable. If he asked you a question, he wanted the answer. If he told you something, he had a reason. And because of that, when Ray finally said what he said to John that Thursday night, it carried the weight of months. Not minutes, months. But before we get there, you need to know what Ray noticed first. Because Ray did not come to John with a feeling. He came to him with a pattern. The first thing he noticed was Joyce's phone. Now on its face, that sounds like nothing. Everybody is on their phone. Everybody has habits. People change. That by itself means nothing. But Ray was trained to notice not what people do once, but what they do repeatedly after they stop realizing anyone is watching. Joyce used to leave her phone around. On the kitchen counter. On the arm of the couch. Face up on the coffee table when they watched movies. Not careless, just comfortable. Then somewhere over the summer, that changed. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. No, it changed the way these things usually change. One small adjustment at a time. She started putting it face down. Always. She started carrying it into the next room, even when she was just stepping away for a minute. She started taking it into the bathroom. She used to leave it on the counter while cooking. Now it stayed with her. Dinner would be halfway over, and she would glance at the screen, then stand up and say she needed to take this outside. Once is nothing. Twice is maybe work. But when a habit changes and then hardens, people like Ray notice. He didn't say anything. He just watched. The second thing he noticed was mileage. That sounds boring until it doesn't. Part of Ray's job included keeping track of household vehicles. Maintenance, service schedules, keeping things secure, knowing what was where. Routine stuff. The kind of routine stuff most people ignore until it tells them something they can't unsee. Joyce drove a Mercedes. She had errands, lunches, a friend named Denise she saw now and then. Denise lived 11 miles away. Ray knew that because Ray knew everything practical. He noticed that on days Joyce said she was running errands or grabbing lunch with Denise, the mileage didn't match the story. A simple lunch out and back should have been maybe 30 miles, give or take. Instead, he was seeing 70, 80, one day over 100. That doesn't prove cheating. It doesn't even prove lying, but it proves movement. It proves there are hours somewhere that don't fit the version of the day being offered at home. Ray wrote the numbers down in a small notebook he kept for work. Nothing dramatic. Just dates. Mileage. Notes. He still said nothing. The third thing was the one most people miss because it looks at first like affection. Joyce got nicer. Not warmer, exactly. Not more present. Just nicer in a way that felt slightly off. She bought John little gifts for no reason. Suggested trips. Laughed a little harder at jokes that weren't that funny. Reached for him more in public. If you don't know what guilt looks like, you might think that sounds like a wife trying to reconnect. And sometimes it is. But Ray had seen enough people hiding things to know guilt often comes dressed as extra tenderness. Not because the person has rediscovered love, but because some part of them is trying to soften the damage before it lands. He would later describe it to a colleague in a way that stuck with me. He said Joyce was being nice in a way that felt like an apology. That is such a small sentence, but if you've ever been around somebody carrying a secret, you know exactly what it means. There's a kind of kindness that has peace behind it, and there's a kind that has fear behind it. They do not feel the same. John either did not notice or did not want to turn what he noticed into something real. And before anyone judges him for that, let's be honest about human nature. When you love someone deeply, your mind does not rush to betrayal. It resists it. It bargains with it. It explains around it. Because the moment you allow yourself to see what might be happening, your whole life changes shape, and most people are not eager to volunteer for that kind of pain. John was also busy. That mattered. His business had grown. He was traveling more. Meetings, contracts, clients, flights in and out of Raleigh, Atlanta, Nashville. He was stretched, not absent in the deadbeat sense, but mentally occupied in the way a lot of providers get occupied. Always thinking 2 moves ahead. Always carrying pressure no one sees because he has gotten good at carrying it quietly. Joyce knew that. Ray knew that. Maybe that is part of why Joyce got away with what she got away with for as long as she did. Because John was the kind of man who assumed if there was a problem inside the marriage, it would be spoken. He believed in directness. He believed in grown people using words. That belief would hurt him later. Ray watched all of this for 4 months. 4 months of change phone habits. 4 months of mileage that didn't add up. 4 months of sweetness that didn't feel clean. And still he said nothing. Not because he didn't care. Because he understood exactly how dangerous it was to step into another man's marriage with suspicion and no proof. He could lose his job. He could insult John. He could be wrong. A man in Ray's position does not get to be reckless just because his instincts are strong. So he waited. He kept watching. He let the pattern either collapse or confirm itself. And then one Thursday in October, the whole thing moved from suspicion into something he could no longer ignore. John was in Raleigh that week for meetings with a potential client. 2 days. He was supposed to come back later that night, but the meetings wrapped early and he caught an earlier flight. He didn't call ahead. Not to surprise anyone. Not to catch anyone. He was just tired and wanted his own bed. Ray picked him up at the airport. Simple as that. But earlier that afternoon, while John was still in Raleigh and Joyce thought the day belonged to her, Ray had been at the house dealing with a vendor. John had approved a security camera upgrade. Routine maintenance. Electricians in, paperwork, check placements, basic walkthrough. In the middle of that, Ray stepped into the home office. It was a shared space John and Joyce both used. Nothing unusual about that either. What mattered was what he saw on Joyce's side of the desk. A purse. Not her usual one. Not the tan leather tote she carried all the time. This was smaller. Black. Compact. Tucked partly behind a stack of folders like it had been set down fast and forgotten or hidden in a hurry. The top was slightly open. Ray did not go through it. He would never say he did, and from everything anyone later said about him, I believe that. But he looked at it because it was there and because by then his instincts were fully awake. Through the opening, he saw 2 things. One was what looked like a second phone. Cheap. Small. Not her regular one. The kind of phone people buy when they do not want to trail. The second was a folded piece of paper or card, cream-colored, half-tucked inside. He couldn't read it from where he stood. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Something in him locked into place right then. Because once you have months of pattern and then you suddenly see a hidden phone in a second purse in a shared office on a day the husband is out of town, the story starts telling itself. That was the moment Ray stopped asking whether he should speak and started asking how. He carried that question with him to the airport. When John got in the back seat, he looked tired. Not upset, not suspicious, just tired in the way a man looks after too many meetings and not enough sleep. Ray pulled out of the airport and drove toward Ballantyne. For a while, neither of them said much. Traffic moved. Headlights slid across the windshield. John looked out the window, probably thinking about home, dinner, maybe what he had to do the next morning. Ray was thinking about how 4 words can destroy a marriage and save a man at the same time. Because that was the truth of it. If he spoke, there was no taking it back. If he stayed silent, John might go on living inside a lie while the people around him pretended not to see it. That is a different kind of betrayal. Not the kind Joyce was committing, but betrayal all the same. Loyalty is easy when it costs you nothing. It gets harder when it asks you to be the one who ruins a peaceful evening forever. Ray drove another few miles. He checked the rearview mirror once. Then again. Finally he spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just flat, controlled, like a man reporting weather before a storm. John, I need to tell you something before we get home, and I need you to hear me out before you react. John looked up. What's going on? Ray took a breath and did what men like him do when they need to say something terrible. He stripped it down to facts. He told him Joyce's phone habits had changed. He told him about the mileage. He told him about the way her behavior around him felt wrong. Then he told him about the purse in the office. The black one. The second phone. The paper inside. He said, "It's still there. I didn't touch it, but I think you need to look." And for a long few seconds, John said nothing at all. That silence matters. People imagine moments like this as instant anger, instant denial, instant noise. But real shock is usually quieter than that. Real shock is your mind trying to decide whether what it just heard belongs in the world you know or in some other world you are not ready to enter. John sat back and stared through the windshield. Ray would later say he watched him age in under a minute. Not physically, but in the eyes. In the way a man's face changes when a possibility enters it that he has no defense against. They kept driving, almost home. Joyce's Mercedes was already in the driveway when they pulled in. John didn't move right away. He sat in the back seat with one hand resting on his leg, not speaking, not breathing quite right. Then finally he opened the door and stepped out. There are moments in life where everything still looks normal, and that is the cruelest part. The house was lit. The night was ordinary. Nothing outside the walls announced that a marriage was hanging by a thread. John walked in the way he always did. Calm, controlled. He stepped inside. Joyce was in the kitchen. She turned when she heard him, and for 1 second, she looked surprised. Just 1 second. Then she smiled and crossed him and hugged him hello. That moment stayed with him later. Not because the hug itself meant anything, but because once doubt enters your body, even familiar kindness starts to feel like evidence. John hugged her back, said he got in early. She said that was nice, asked if he was hungry. Nothing in her tone gave away panic. Nothing in her face confessed a thing. And maybe that hurt more than anything that would come later. Because if a person can lie while standing 2 feet from you and still sound normal, you start questioning not just them, but your own ability to know anybody at all. John told her he needed to check something in the office. He walked there on legs that already knew his life had shifted, even if his mind was still trying to keep up. And that is where I'm going to stop part 1. Because the next thing John Delaney does is open that purse. And what he finds inside does not just tell him his wife has a secret. It tells him a life he believed and may have been over long before he ever knew to grieve it. John closed the office door behind him without slamming it. That detail mattered later. A slammed door would have meant anger, certainty, a man already sure of what he was about to find. But John didn't know yet. Not fully. Not in a way his mind was ready to hold. He just knew Ray Torres didn't speak unless something was real, and somewhere in the house his wife was humming softly in the kitchen like nothing in the world had changed. The office looked the same as it always did. Papers on a desk. A laptop half closed. A lamp throwing warm light across the wood surface. For a strange second, John wondered if Ray had been mistaken. Maybe it wasn't her purse. Maybe it was something else. Maybe this whole moment would collapse into nothing, and he would walk back into the kitchen feeling foolish for even letting the thought exist. Then he saw it. The black purse. Exactly where Ray said it would be. Half hidden behind a stack of folders on Joyce's side of the desk. Not the tan leather tote she carried everywhere. This one was smaller, sleeker, and suddenly John felt something heavy settle into his chest. Not panic, not anger, something colder. The kind of quiet dread that comes when part of you already knows the answer, but still hopes you're wrong. He stepped closer. The purse wasn't locked. The top zipper was open just enough that he could see the edge of something inside. His hand hovered for a second, not shaking, just paused, because once he opened it, the world would split into 2 versions. The life before he looked, and the life after. He exhaled once and reached in. The first thing his fingers touched was the phone. It was cheap, lightweight, nothing like the sleek phone Joyce carried every day. This one looked like the kind you buy quickly at a gas station or electronics store when you don't want paperwork or a contract. A prepaid phone, a burner. John stared at it for several seconds before pressing the power button. The screen lit up immediately. No long boot time. That meant it had been used recently. It was a lock screen, for numbers required. But even locked, the phone betrayed something. A notification sat on the screen. A preview from a messaging app. Only part of the message visible. but visible enough. Derek, miss you already. John didn't move. His brain did something strange in that moment. It tried to reinterpret the name. Derek could be anyone. A co-worker, a client, someone from church, someone from Joyce's business network. But the tone of the message erased that illusion before it even formed. Miss you already. Not formal, not work, not innocent. John placed the phone gently back on the desk. Slowly, deliberately. Then he reached back into the purse. The second thing he pulled out was a folded receipt. At first he thought it might be the paper Ray had seen earlier. But when he opened it, he recognized the header immediately. The Fig Tree Restaurant. One of the nicer restaurants in uptown Charlotte. Not the kind of place people go for a quick business lunch. The kind of place couples go when they want the evening to mean something. The date was 3 weeks earlier. Dinner for two. Wine. Dessert. The total was high, but not shocking for a place like that. What caught John's attention was the payment line. The bill had been split. One payment came from a card ending in numbers he didn't recognize. John knew the numbers on Joyce's cards. He knew them the way people who share finances eventually do. This wasn't one of them. He folded the receipt again and set it beside the phone. 2 pieces now. 2 cracks in the life he thought he was standing in. But the third item was the one that made everything stop. It was a small envelope, cream-colored, the kind florists tuck into bouquets. For a moment, John just looked at it without opening it. Something about the size of it, the simplicity, the quietness of that little envelope felt heavier than the phone or the receipt. He slid the card out. The handwriting wasn't Joyce's. He knew that instantly. The message was short. I know this isn't simple, but you know what we have. Don't keep choosing the life you're supposed to have over the one that actually makes you feel alive. John read it once. Then again. The room didn't spin the way people describe in movies. The house didn't collapse around him. Real shock is quieter than that. Real shock is the absence of movement. He just stood there holding a card that confirmed something no husband ever wants confirmed. His wife wasn't just seeing someone else. She was sharing a life with someone else. An emotional one. A secret one. The kind that grows in quiet spaces between lies. John placed the card on the desk next to the other items. Phone. Receipt. Card. 3 objects. 3 simple objects capable of dismantling 11 years of marriage faster than any argument ever could. From the kitchen, Joyce laughed softly at something on the television. The sound drifted down the hallway and stopped just outside the office door like a reminder that the person who had written that card had been standing inside his house hundreds of times while he had no idea who she was becoming. John closed his eyes for a moment. Not long, just enough to steady himself. When he opened them again, the first instinct every wounded partner feels was already pushing forward. Walk back into the kitchen. Put the card on the counter. Ask the question, who is Derek? But John didn't do that. Not because he wasn't angry. Because something deeper than anger had taken over. Discipline. The same discipline that built his company. The same discipline that got him through years of work most people would have quit halfway through. He understood something in that moment most people only realize after they've made a mess of everything. If he confronted her now, with half the picture, she could lie. She could cry. She could twist the story into something smaller. And if there was one thing John Delaney wanted in that moment, it was not a story. It was the truth, the full truth. He returned every item to the purse exactly the way he had found it. Phone first. Receipt folded the same way. Card back into its envelope. Then he placed the purse behind the folders again so the scene looked untouched. When he stepped back into the kitchen, Joyce was leaning against the counter, scrolling her real phone. She smiled when she saw him. There was nothing forced in it, nothing nervous. That was the strangest part of all. You expect guilt to look guilty, but most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time, it looks exactly like normal life. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, John said. His voice sounded steady even to himself. Just checking an email. She nodded and went back to the screen. Dinner was already on the stove. Something simple. Pasta. Garlic. The smell filled the kitchen in a way that should have felt like home. John sat at the table while she finished cooking. He watched her move around the kitchen. The same woman he had watched 1,000 evenings before. Same hair pulled back loosely. Same small crease near her left eye when she smiled. Same familiar rhythm of someone comfortable in their own house. But now every movement felt like it belonged to someone he had just met. They ate together. That part matters. Because most people imagine the discovery of betrayal as an explosion. Plates thrown, voices raised, doors slammed. But sometimes the cruelest moments are the quietest ones. John twirled pasta on his fork and asked about her day. She said she had gone to the gym, answered a few client emails, talked to her mother on the phone. Normal things. Completely normal. Each word landed differently now. Because once a lie enters a marriage, every other sentence starts looking suspicious even if it's true. They finished dinner, watched a little television, sat on the same couch they had shared for years. And all the while John carried the knowledge of Derek in the back of his mind like a weight he refused to drop until he understood exactly how heavy it really was. Later that night, after Joyce fell asleep, John walked quietly downstairs and sat in the living room with the lights off. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He stared at his phone for a long time before finally dialing one number. His brother James answered on the third ring. "Everything okay?" James asked immediately. John didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair and looked into the darkness of his own living room. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I think my wife might be living another life." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Not disbelief, just the pause of someone understanding the weight of the words he had just heard. "Tell me everything," James said, and John did. He told him about Ray, about the phone, about the receipt, about the card from Derek. When he finished, James let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said calmly. "First thing, don't confront her yet." John almost laughed at that. "I wasn't planning to." "Good," James continued, "because right now you don't have the whole picture. What you have is enough to hurt you, but not enough to protect you." "So what do I do?" John asked. The answer came without hesitation. "You get the truth first. All of it. Then you decide what your life looks like." John sat in silence again. For the first time since opening that purse, he felt something besides shock. Direction. "How?" he asked. James answered in the same grounded tone he had used their entire lives. "You hire someone who knows how to find things people are trying to hide." That conversation lasted almost 2 hours. By the time John hung up the phone, it was past midnight. The house upstairs was quiet. Joyce was sleeping in their bed, unaware that the first crack in her secret life had already widened into something that could never be closed again. And somewhere in Charlotte, a man named Derek Holt had no idea that the husband he thought he was invisible to had just begun looking directly at him. The next morning, John Delaney woke up and started gathering the truth piece by piece. And what he was about to discover over the next 14 days would make the contents of that purse look like the smallest part of the story. The next 14 days did not look dramatic from the outside. That was the strange thing about them. Nothing exploded. No door slammed. No voices were raised in the house in Ballantyne. If you had driven past the Delaney home any evening during those 2 weeks, you would have seen the same lights on, the same quiet driveway, the same couple moving through what looked like an ordinary life. But inside John Delaney's mind, everything had changed. The moment he saw the name Derek on that phone screen, the world split into 2 layers. The visible one everyone else saw, and the hidden one he had just started uncovering. The morning after he found the purse, John got up at the same time he always did. 6:30. Shower. Coffee. A quick glance at his email before heading to the office. Joyce came downstairs while he was pouring coffee. She kissed him on the cheek like she always did. "You heading in early?" she asked. "Yeah," John said. "Got a few things I need to sort out." That was true. Just not the kind of thing she imagined. When he walked out the door and got into his truck, the first call he made wasn't to work. It was to the number his brother had given him the night before, a private investigator based in Charlotte. The man's name was Michael Granger, former police detective, quiet reputation for being thorough and discreet. When Granger answered, John kept the conversation short. He explained the situation in the simplest possible terms. "I think my wife is having an affair," he said, "and I need to know the truth before I say anything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not surprise, just the pause of a man who had heard that sentence hundreds of times before. "Do you have a name?" Granger asked. John thought of the lock screen message. Derek. Possibly, he said. I'll send you everything I have. By that afternoon, they had a plan. For the next several days, John would do exactly what he had done the night before. Nothing different. Nothing suspicious. Meanwhile, Granger's team would start quietly building the picture John needed. The hardest part for John wasn't the waiting. It was the acting. Acting normal. Acting like the man Joyce believed he still was. Because every normal moment had started to feel like theater. That evening when he came home from work, Joyce was sitting on the couch with her laptop. She looked up and smiled the same way she had the night before. How was your day? She asked. Busy, John said. It wasn't a lie. His business really was busy. But now there was a second job running in the background of his life. Watching, listening, noticing every small thing he had never paid attention to before. Joyce's phone was on the coffee table. Face down. John noticed it immediately now. Before Ray pointed it out, he might not have thought twice about that detail. Now it was impossible to ignore. They talked about small things that night. Work. A client John was meeting next week. A movie Joyce wanted to see. Normal conversation. Except John now listened the way investigators listen. Carefully, quietly, measuring every word. It was a strange experience, discovering how easily someone you love can lie while looking directly into your eyes. Over the next few days, pieces of the truth started arriving in John's inbox from Michael Granger. The first report was simple. Derek Holt, 36 years old, commercial real estate broker, office in South Park, clean background, no criminal record, no public scandals, just a successful man moving in the same professional circles Joyce had been networking in over the last couple of years. The name didn't mean much to John at first, but the second report did. It contained photos, nothing dramatic, just a series of images taken over several afternoons and evenings across Charlotte. Joyce getting into her Mercedes, driving across town, parking near a building in South Park. Derek Holt meeting her outside. A quick hug that lasted slightly longer than a casual greeting. Then both of them walking into a restaurant together. One photo showed them leaving the restaurant hours later. Derek's hand resting lightly on the small of Joyce's back. That small gesture hit John harder than the phone message had. Because that was intimacy. Familiarity. The kind that grows over time. It meant this wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. This was a relationship. A few days later, Granger sent something else. Travel records. Credit card charges. Hotel bookings. One of them stood out immediately. A weekend trip to Asheville, North Carolina, 3 months earlier. Joyce had told John she was going on a short getaway with her friend Denise. A girls' weekend. Shopping. Wine. Relaxing. The investigators' report confirmed Denise had never been there. Instead, Joyce and Derek had checked into a small boutique hotel together on a Friday afternoon and left Sunday morning. John stared at that line in the report for a long time, because that weekend had meant something to him. He remembered calling Joyce Saturday night while she was supposedly out with Denise. She had sounded relaxed, happy even. She had told him they were sitting on a balcony overlooking the mountains. He remembered thinking at the time how nice it was that she was taking time for herself. Now he understood what that happiness had actually been. Another report followed 2 days later. Jewelry purchase. A bracelet from a high-end store in South Park. The date of the purchase matched the same week Joyce had come home wearing the bracelet and casually told John it was a gift from a client. John remembered that moment clearly now. He had even complimented it, said it looked expensive. Joyce had laughed and said sometimes clients like to say thank you properly. The memory now felt like a bruise. By the end of the first week, the pattern was undeniable. Lunches, dinners, afternoons together during the hours John believed she was running errands. At least one overnight trip, possibly more. And messages, hundreds of them. Granger had managed to recover partial communication record from Derek's phone through legal data scraping methods used by investigators. Not full conversations, but enough fragments to paint the picture. Miss you. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Wish we had more time last night. And one message that stayed with John longer than the rest. You deserve to feel alive again. John closed the report after reading that line, because suddenly the card he had found in the purse made more sense. Derek wasn't just someone Joyce was seeing. He had positioned himself as an escape, an alternative life, the man offering her something she apparently believed she was missing. That night, John sat across from Joyce at dinner again. She was talking about something that had happened with a client earlier that day, laughing about how difficult the woman had been. John nodded in the right places, asked the right questions, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Watching, measuring, realizing something painful. Joyce was still very good at pretending nothing had changed. That realization hurt more than the affair itself, because it meant she had been practicing this version of normal for a long time. A few days later, John quietly reached out to Denise. Not accusingly, not directly, just a simple message asking how she had enjoyed Asheville a few months back. Denise's response came almost immediately. Asheville? What do you mean? John stared at the phone screen. That was the final confirmation he needed. When the second week ended, Michael Granger called instead of emailing. I think you have enough now, he said calmly. John was sitting alone in his office at Delaney Transport when he heard those words. Papers were spread across his desk. Contracts waiting to be reviewed. Work that normally would have consumed his attention. But none of it mattered right now. How long? John asked quietly. Granger didn't need clarification. At least 18 months, he said. John closed his eyes for a moment. 18 months. A year and a half of dinners, conversations, holidays, birthdays, ordinary days, lived beside someone who had already stepped outside the life they built together. When John opened his eyes again, something inside him had changed. Not rage, not grief, something steadier. Clarity. Because now the question was no longer whether the affair existed. The question was what he was going to do about it. That evening when he drove home, Ray Torres was waiting near the garage, as usual. Ray looked at him once and knew immediately that something had shifted. You find out? He asked quietly. John nodded. Yeah. Ray didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. You going to talk to her? He said. John looked at the front door of his house. The same house that had once felt like the safest place in his life. Not tonight, he said. Ray studied him for a second before speaking again. When you do, make sure you already know the answers. John nodded again. Edo. Because now he had the full picture. The messages, the trips, the lies, and a man named Derek Holt who had spent the last 18 months slowly stepping into a life that had never belonged to him. That night, after dinner, John asked Joyce a simple question. Do you have time to talk tomorrow evening? Joyce looked up from her phone. Sure, she said. About what? John held her gaze for a moment before answering. About us. Joyce smiled softly. Of course, she said. But for the first time in 18 months, the story she had been telling was about to end. And the truth she had been avoiding was about to walk into the room. The next evening arrived quietly, almost politely, like any other weekday in the Delaney house. That was the strange thing about life when something big was about to happen. The world didn't signal it. Traffic still moved. People still ordered dinner. The sun still went down at the same time it always did. But inside John Delaney, something had already settled into place. He had spent 2 weeks learning the truth piece by piece, and by the time he drove home that evening, he wasn't walking into a confrontation anymore. He was walking into the end of a lie. Joyce was in the kitchen when he stepped inside. She looked up with the same easy smile she had worn every evening of the past 14 days. Hey, she said. You're home early. John nodded slightly. Yeah. She noticed something in his face then. Not anger, not sadness, just a quiet seriousness that hadn't been there before. Everything okay? She asked. John set his keys on the counter slowly. Can we sit down for a minute? He said. The words themselves weren't dramatic, but something in his tone made Joyce pause. She dried her hands with a towel and followed him into the living room. They sat across from each other, not on the couch they normally shared, but in the 2 chairs opposite one another near the window. John had chosen that spot deliberately. The distance between them mattered. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Joyce waited. Finally, she broke the silence. You're starting to worry me a little, she said with a soft laugh. John looked at her steadily. I need you to listen for a few minutes before you say anything, he said. Joyce's expression shifted slightly. Confusion, curiosity, maybe the faintest hint of unease. Okay, she said. John leaned forward and rested his hands together. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. 2 weeks ago, I came home early from Raleigh, he began. Joyce nodded. Yeah, I remember. Ray said something to me in the car on the way home. John continued. He told me to check your purse. The change in Joyce's face happened quickly, but not quickly enough to hide it. A flicker, a brief tightening around her eyes. Then it was gone. My purse, she repeated lightly. Why would he? John didn't raise his voice. He simply continued speaking. The black one in the office. Joyce didn't interrupt again. John reached into the folder he had brought with him and placed 3 items on the small table between them. The phone, the restaurant receipt, the card. Joyce stared at them. Her breathing changed first, slightly faster. I know everything, Joyce, John said quietly. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to press against the walls of the room. Joyce looked from the items to John and back again. For a moment she tried to speak, but no words came out. Then she shook her head faintly. John, before you say anything, John said gently, just understand something. I didn't confront you that night because I didn't want guesses. I wanted the truth. He slid another document across the table. The investigator's report. Joyce didn't open it. She didn't need to. Tears had already started forming in her eyes. How long? John asked quietly. Joyce looked down at her hands. John, how long? He repeated. This time his voice carried a firmness she had never heard before. Joyce inhaled slowly. About 1.5 years, she whispered. The words hung in the air like something fragile and irreversible. John nodded once. He had already known that answer, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a different way. Joyce wiped her eyes quickly. It didn't start the way you think, she said quickly. It started as work. We met at a networking event. We kept running into each other at conferences. It was just conversation at first. John didn't interrupt. He just listened. And then, over time, Joyce's voice cracked. I don't know. Things changed. She looked up at him now, desperate to make him understand something. I felt lonely, John. The sentence came out in a rush. You were always working, always traveling. Even when you were home, you were thinking about the business. I started feeling like I was living beside you instead of with you. John's expression didn't harden. If anything, it softened slightly. I hear that, he said quietly. Joyce blinked in surprise. You do? She asked. Yes, John said. I know I haven't been perfect. The admission seemed to give her hope. Then you understand how it happened, she said quickly. John shook his head slowly. No, he said. I understand feeling lonely. But loneliness in a marriage is a conversation. Joyce's lips trembled. What you chose was something else, John continued gently. You didn't come to me and say you were slipping away. You didn't ask us to fix it. You built another relationship instead. Joyce looked away, because there was no real answer to that. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered. John glanced at the bracelet on her wrist, the one Derek had bought. But it did, he said. Another silence fell between them. This one felt heavier. Finally, Joyce spoke again. Do you hate me? She asked quietly. John leaned back in the chair and looked at her for a long moment. No, he said honestly. That answer surprised both of them. I'm hurt, he continued. I am disappointed. And I'm trying to understand how the woman I trusted more than anyone else could live 2 lives for 18 months. Joyce's tears were flowing freely now. I never stopped loving you, she said quickly. John didn't respond right away, because that sentence had been part of the messages the investigator found too. The same words Joyce had told Derek. Love means different things to different people, he realized. Finally, John spoke again. What happens next depends on whether you're willing to be honest now, he said. Joyce nodded immediately. I will be, she said. I promise. John studied her carefully. Then here's what I'm willing to do, he said. I'm not making a decision about our marriage tonight. Joyce looked up quickly. Hope flickered across her face. You're not. John shook his head. Something this big deserves more than one emotional evening. He paused. But the lies stopped now. Joyce nodded again, wiping her eyes. Yes. And if we're going to try to repair this, John continued, it will take real work. Counseling. Honesty. No more contact with him. Joyce hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but John noticed. I can do that, she said. John nodded slowly. Then we take 30 days, he said. 30 days to figure out if there's anything here worth rebuilding. Joyce let out a shaky breath. "Okay," she whispered. For the first time that evening, she looked almost relieved. But John noticed something else in her eyes, too. Something uncertain. Something unfinished. That moment mattered more than either of them realized. Because over the next 30 days, the question wouldn't be whether Joyce felt guilty. The question would be whether she had truly left the other life behind. And sometimes remorse and commitment are not the same thing at all. John stood up slowly. The conversation was over for now. Joyce remained seated, staring down at the items on the table. The phone, the receipt, the card. 3 objects that had dragged their entire marriage into the open. As John walked toward the hallway, Joyce spoke softly behind him. "John." He stopped but didn't turn around yet. "Thank you for not giving up on us tonight," she said. John closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "We'll see what the next 30 days look like," he said quietly. And as he walked upstairs, something inside him already knew that the hardest part of the story had not happened yet. The next 30 days moved slowly, but not in the way people expect when a marriage is hanging in the balance. There were no dramatic arguments. No shouting in the middle of the night. From the outside, the Delaney house still looked calm. John went to work every morning. Joyce answered emails, took calls, went to the gym. They even sat down for dinner most nights the way they always had. But the air between them had changed. Something invisible now lived in the room with them. Trust, once broken, doesn't disappear in a loud moment. It leaves quietly, and once it's gone, everything else begins to feel slightly off. For the first few days after their conversation, Joyce seemed determined to repair things. She scheduled a marriage counseling appointment without John asking. She kept her phone on the table instead of carrying it everywhere. She checked in with him more, asking how his day had gone, sitting a little closer on the couch in the evenings. And John noticed. He noticed every effort, but he also noticed something else that he couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't what Joyce was doing wrong. It was something about what she wasn't fully letting go of. Counseling started the following week. The therapist's office was quiet and neutral, designed to make people feel safe while they said difficult things. Joyce talked openly about feeling disconnected over the past few years, about how the business had slowly consumed more and more of John's attention. John listened and acknowledged what was true. He had been consumed by work. That part of her story wasn't false. But every time the conversation moved toward accountability, toward the decisions Joyce had made during those 18 months, something subtle happened. Joyce would hesitate, not deny, not lie, just soften the edges of the truth, as if part of her still wanted to believe the story wasn't entirely her fault. The therapist asked careful questions about communication, about resentment, about unmet needs. Those conversations mattered, but they didn't solve the deeper problem that John felt every time he looked at his wife now. The feeling that part of her heart had been somewhere else for a long time. Still, John stayed patient. He had promised 30 days. And John Delaney was not the kind of man who broke his own word halfway through something difficult. 2 weeks into that period, things almost started to feel normal again. Not the old normal, but a fragile version of it. Joyce laughed a little more. John found himself relaxing slightly during dinner conversations. For a few evenings, they even sat together on the back patio, talking about ordinary things. Work, travel, a possible vacation later in the year. Those moments almost gave John hope. Almost. But hope is a fragile thing when trust has been damaged. And sometimes the truth reveals itself not through grand discoveries, but through small moments people don't realize anyone is watching. It was the 26th day. John came home earlier than usual that evening. He parked his truck quietly and walked toward the house through the side yard instead of the driveway. As he approached the sliding glass doors that opened onto the backyard patio, he heard Joyce's voice. She was outside, on the phone. John slowed without meaning to. He hadn't planned to listen. He hadn't been trying to catch her in anything. But something about the tone of her voice made him stop. It was soft, familiar. The same tone people use when they're speaking to someone they care about deeply. John stood just inside the shadow of the house and listened. "I know," Joyce was saying quietly. "I know it's complicated." A pause, then a small laugh. The kind she used to give John years ago when they were still in the early days of their relationship. "I miss you too," she said softly. That was enough. John didn't need to hear the name on the other end of the line. He already knew. The moment stretched for a few seconds. John didn't step outside. He didn't confront her. He simply turned around and walked back into the house. Upstairs, he sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, staring at the wall. And what he felt wasn't anger, not even heartbreak anymore. It was clarity, because in that single moment, the question he had been carrying for nearly a month had finally answered itself. You cannot rebuild a life with someone who still has one foot in another door. John picked up his phone and dialed the one person who had been steady through all of this. His brother answered on the second ring. "Hey," James said. John didn't waste time explaining everything again. He just said 4 words. "I'm done, James." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then James spoke quietly. "You sure?" John looked around the bedroom he had shared with Joyce for more than a decade. "Yeah," he said. "Not because I stopped loving her." He paused. "But because I finally realized loving someone isn't enough if they're not choosing you back." James didn't try to talk him out of it. He just said, "Then you know what you have to do." For days later, John filed for divorce. The process itself was surprisingly calm. Joyce didn't fight it the way people sometimes do when a marriage ends in anger. Maybe because deep down she understood the same thing John had realized on the patio that evening. The marriage had already ended long before the paperwork caught up to it. The house in Ballantyne was sold a few months later. John moved to a smaller place in Dilworth, a quiet neighborhood with older trees and streets where people actually knew their neighbors. It felt different from the big house. Simpler, more honest. The business continued to grow. In fact, some of the people who worked closely with John said he seemed sharper in the months after the divorce than he had in years. Pain does that sometimes. It burns away distractions. Ray Torres stayed with John for another year before eventually moving on to other work. But the two men stayed in touch. John never forgot the moment in that car when Ray had chosen loyalty over comfort, because loyalty like that is rare. As for Joyce and Derek Holt, their relationship didn't survive the shift from secrecy to reality. That part of the story is almost predictable. The excitement of hidden relationships often fades when the world can finally see them clearly. Derek drifted away within months, and Joyce was left with the life she had once thought wasn't enough. John didn't speak badly about her afterward. Not to friends, not to co-workers. When people asked, he usually kept it simple. Sometimes people grow in different directions, he would say, but occasionally, when someone close to him needed advice about relationships or trust, he would tell them the real story. He would tell them about the night he flew home early from Raleigh, about the quiet ride from the airport, about the 4 words that changed everything. "Check your wife's purse." And then he would say something else that surprised people when they heard it. He would say he was grateful, not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the truth. Because the alternative would have been living the rest of his life inside a lie he never knew existed. And John Delaney had learned something from that experience that most people only understand much later. A single honest moment, no matter how painful, is still better than a lifetime of comfortable deception.